We committed the cardinal sin of these invasions, which is to have ridiculously overambitious aims, to recreate Washington in Baghdad. Lord Ashdown, member of the Iraq Commission.
Welcome back to this Inside Iraq special from London, where my guests are former UN envoy Lord David Haney and Dr. Rosemary Hollis, Director of Research at Chatham House. Lord Haney, Iraq cannot be solved only militarily. It has to be a diplomatic offensive. Are the British planning, in conjunction with the Americans, the next phase of the Iraq salvation through diplomacy?
Well, there has been a certain amount of activity already for some months now in trying to bring the neighbours of Iraq into some collective approach which would help to stabilise the situation. And the Iraq Commission's report very strongly encouraged carrying that forward in an active and effective way. It's not easy, of course, because the interests of Iraq's neighbours are not identical, and the possibility that they might end up as adversaries if Iraq were to collapse or disintegrate is very strong. But hopefully, and that was certainly the assessment we made, probably all Iraq's neighbours have a greater investment in a single sovereign independent Iraq than they do in a fragmented Iraq, which might pull them into a regional war. So, planning on that basis, we are recommending that a lot more should be done to try to get this collective effort off the ground.
For the future of Iraq, under the UN auspices, we would like to see that capitalized upon. We would like to see under the UN umbrella, a bringing together of all of Iraq's neighbours, not just some of them, and no bilateral trade-offs, but rather a collective endeavour and a collective treaty with the Iraqis to guarantee their future.
That bilateral trade-off right now is not happening. As recent as yesterday, the US ambassador to Iraq, Ryan Crocker, says the Iranians are still supplying these deadly weapons to the militias.
Yeah, I think that's precisely the point, that if it's left as a bilateral matter between the United States and Iran, at some level, the United States and Iran are in their own bilateral confrontation over the future of Iraq. The situation, therefore, needs moving to another regional level with international blessing, involvement of all the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. And that's the kind of level at which this has a greater chance of being taken forward than just between the Americans and the Iranians on a bilateral level.
Lord Haney, one thing the Americans are adamantly refusing to do, and that is to link the security of Iraq with Iran's nuclear quest. But that has always been on the table, and that has always will be the driving ambition of Iran. How do you break this two? How do you uncouple it?
The Americans are not saying they won't talk to the Iranians about things wider than the nuclear, because the position taken by the 3 European powers, Germany, France and Britain, by Russia, China and the United States, when they imposed both the sanctions packages in New York last December and last March, was that if Iran suspended enrichment, then they would talk about the whole range of issues that concern Iran, including, of course, its own security concerns, but also including the nuclear issue, also including regional issues. So that offer is on the table. What the Americans are saying in relation to the dialogue they're having in Baghdad is that that can only cover Iraq. I don't think that's necessarily going to get very far.
Until the Iranians make up their mind regarding the nuclear file, and if we believe the statement by Mohammed al-Baradei of the IAEA, saying the Iranians right now, they have slowed down the enrichment. They did not stop it. But let's go back to Iraq. Before the multilateral approach, shouldn't Iraqis first and foremost get into national reconciliation? That has been talked about for the past 3 years, and absolutely nothing's happening on that front.
Actually, I think the Commission has been rather careful not to get into detailed recommendations about what the Iraqis should do amongst themselves.
Why is that?
That's because these reconciliation questions are very much an Iraqi question. When it comes to the hydrocarbon law and the future of Iraq's energy resources, we have recognized that as very much an Iraqi issue. And we are recognizing the limits of what foreigners can do when it comes to national pride and the national assets.
Lord Haney, that's a very admirable approach, not to interfere in the domestic affairs of a country, but that country happens to be occupied, and the majority of the people holding the levers of power, they came with the occupiers, and somehow they are incapable of sitting on the same table for an hour to talk about national reconciliation.
Well, it's not an easy one to crack, and we are suggesting that the UN should appoint a new high-level representative there to help facilitate the work of the Iraqi parties. But the one thing that did seem clear to us is that it is not the outsiders who can simply bang heads together and get the Iraqis to do what they, the outsiders, want them to do. That is not going to work. That's been tried for 4 years now, and it hasn't worked. And so now an approach has to be tried, in our view, which recognizes that Iraq did resume its sovereignty, did hold elections, has got an elected government, and that government needs to be made to work by the people who elected it, by the parties who elected it. Now, do they need some outside help? We think they do, which is the reason for the idea of a UN high-level person there to help them. Should they be pushed into it by the Americans or the British? No, that's not going to work.
Despite the British experience of Iraq and knowledge of its history and involvement back in the 1917?
I think that's been much overdone, I'm afraid, because the British forces that went into Iraq in 2003 didn't somehow by osmosis or inheritance know that much about Iraq. What they knew was war in urban settings and peace enforcement and peacekeeping in urban settings from their experiences in the Balkans and in Northern Ireland, and they applied some of that on the ground. This perception that you find in the region of the Middle East that the British know the region and will act accordingly, I think is a misreading of what was driving the decision to enter Iraq in 2003 as far as the British were concerned. There's another consideration which came out in evidence to the Commission, namely that in overall contribution to the invasion and occupation and then future arrangements for Iraq, both financial and military, the British contribution is a mere 3%. That it requires recognition. The British cannot have overweening ideas about their capacity to turn this situation around.
Lord Haney, looking at Iraq right now with the benefit of 4 years, and now a few revelations has come out, and that is the British somehow, they were not compelled to go in militarily. President Bush has been quoted as saying Britain can help in other ways, but it was the insistence on Tony Blair say, I would like to be side by side with you. When you look at this awful mess, what comes to your mind?
Well, what comes to my mind is that the original decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein may well have been justified, but the actions taken thereafter to get Iraq back on its feet, to get the occupying powers out, to set up a new functioning Iraqi state were grossly mishandled. From the very beginning, they made almost every mistake in the book, and the heritage of those mistakes is now with us, and it's extremely difficult to extract either the British and Americans or the Iraqis from the consequences of those mistakes that were made.
When Lord Haney says the justification for the removal of Saddam is justified, but the execution of the policy is wrong, people in the Middle East, when they hear this, it rubs them the wrong way. You are a student of Middle East history. That kind of attitude, that kind of a statement, it does not go well, does it?
Well, I'm afraid as a result of this whole Iraq tragedy, I do not see the British managing to win the thanks or appreciation or enthusiasm of anybody much in the region for the time being and for some years to come. And I have myself engaged in many, many conversations with Arabs, Iranians, Israelis about the British decision, and I haven't found a single person in the region who appreciates all the dynamics that were at work that influenced the British decision. They believe, on the whole, that that decision was made after an objective appraisal of what Iraq and the region needed. And I'm saying that that decision was made as on the basis of an objective appraisal of what was at stake in the bilateral alliance between the UK and the United States, what was the best way to keep the US in some form of international community, on which the British differed fundamentally with the French on tactics, and that the whole drama was in effect played out in Washington and New York about the decision to go in, not in the region itself.
The final question, less than 1 minute, but despite the portrait depicted by Rosemary Hollis, that decision was illegal.
I don't believe so, no. I know some people do, I know many people do, but that is not my view. My view is that there was a justification in the Security Council resolutions, and the action was taken. The justification in the Security Council resolutions turned out to be erroneous, but that does happen.
Final question, Dr. Rosemary. Are you optimistic?
I'm not optimistic. I'm extremely gloomy, and there's one piece of the report that I don't think we've managed to talk about at all, and that's the humanitarian crisis and the refugees. And the report does recognise that, if nothing else, the British have a responsibility to do the maximum they can to help with the refugee crisis, which is on a proportion not seen since 1945.
Dr. Rosemary Hollis, Director of Research at Chatham House, Lord David Hannay, former British envoy to the United Nations, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq. To access the program and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Goodbye.